Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack John Perkins' truly fascinating account of the hidden gears turning global geopolitics between 1975 and 1981. This was a period of just massive international upheaval, and we'll be looking at it all through the lens of a highly controversial insider perspective. So, let's dive right into this provocative question. Who really controls the wealth of nations? Because, according to Perkins, the answer actually lies in a shadow world, one operating entirely behind the scenes of official government actions. He basically suggests that what you and I see on the nightly news is often just the surface layer of a much deeper, much more calculated economic strategy.
And that brings us to his explosive book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. In this text, Perkins claims to reveal the secret history of how a powerful corporatocracy, think of it as this tight-knit club of massive corporations, banks, and government entities, literally shaped the modern world. And they didn't do it through traditional diplomacy, but through incredibly calculated financial leverage.
Now, right at the center of this whole system is the economic hitman, or EHM. Perkins claims he was one of these highly paid professionals himself. And their primary weapon? It wasn't military force. No, it was crippling national debt. The strategy was brutally simple. If you control a country's debt, you control the country.
Okay, moving to part 1, the Markov deception, or the math behind the empire.
Now, on the surface, selling a developing nation these huge power grids and highways, it sounds like a massive favor, right? Like a clear path to modernization and prosperity. But Perkins argues the hidden reality was actually a deliberate trap. He says these infrastructure loans were mathematically designed to be completely unpayable from day one.
He outlines these specific steps for building a global empire, and get this, they do it without firing a single shot. First, you project massive economic growth to justify massive loans. Then, that loan money, it never actually leaves the United States or other wealthy nations. It just goes straight to corporate engineering firms, like the one Perkins worked for, to build the infrastructure. Finally, when the developing country inevitably defaults on that massive debt, you simply step in and demand their oil or other natural resources at rock-bottom prices.
But to pull a scheme like this off, you need some seriously complex, fabricated math. Perkins and a young MIT mathematician actually developed a tool they called the Markov Method. Basically, by assigning highly subjective probabilities to economic growth, they were able to hide completely inflated predictions behind these dense, confusing equations. This let them scientifically prove that a country desperately needed these loans. It effectively buried lower-income countries under mountains of debt, all while a very select few local elites just got richer.
Which leads us to part 2, Battle for the Canal, and how Omar Torrijos pushes back. According to Perkins, Panamanian head of state Omar Torrijos was one leader who adamantly pushed back against this corporatocracy. Torrijos was actually looking into building a brand new canal funded by the Japanese, and as you can imagine, this completely enraged powerful U.S. engineering firms like Bechtel, who obviously wanted those super lucrative contracts for themselves. But Torrijos absolutely refused to be bought, and he refused to be intimidated.
This quote captures Torrijos' mission perfectly. He aimed to reclaim the canal, not as an act of hostility against America, but as a crucial defense of his own impoverished citizens. He wanted to use Panama's greatest geographic asset to lift his people out of poverty rather than just enriching foreign corporations.
And to achieve this, Torrijos actually engaged directly with Perkins. Recognizing a tiny remnant of idealism from Perkins' older Peace Corps days, Torrijos formed a secret alliance with him. The goal? To ensure Panama's master development plans were genuinely honest and truly factored in the poor, which, for an active economic hitman, was a highly unusual move.
As you'd expect, the tension escalated rapidly. After decades of a 1903 treaty that was literally signed without a single Panamanian present, Torrijos launched a massive political battle. And it worked. It led to the 1977 treaties with Jimmy Carter. But the victory was incredibly short-lived. In 1981, Torrijos died in a highly suspicious plane crash, an event that Perkins very heavily implies was a targeted assassination by CIA assets, people he refers to as jackals.
All right, part 3. The fall of Iran, where the house of cards finally crumbles. Let's dive into what was just an immense intelligence failure here. Washington and corporate interests had poured enormous resources into propping up the Shah of Iran. They mistakenly viewed his capitalist, Western-style reforms as, universally beloved by his people. But they were completely, utterly blinded to the actual realities on the ground.
And the most shocking part? Perkins wasn't just blindsided. He was explicitly warned.
Insiders, including a former Iranian general whose son was actually an old friend of Perkins, warned him directly that the Shah's brutal regime was a literal powder keg just waiting to blow.
And the warnings absolutely didn't stop there. Perkins met secretly with a dissident known as Doc. This was a man who had literally had his nose cut off by the Shah's secret police. Doc explicitly told Perkins that the US-backed government was universally hated and that these foreign companies projecting endless profits would never actually be paid for their infrastructure work. Yet the EHM machine, and apparently the entire US intelligence community, they just entirely ignored these glaring signs.
The so-called global empire ended up unraveling decades of planning in just a matter of months. Think about it. The CIA had installed the Shah way back in 1953, but by late 1978, the entire country exploded in protests. Perkins had to be evacuated just before the Shah fled for good in January of 1979. And that, of course, led directly to the infamous U.S. Embassy hostage crisis. The economic models they relied on, they failed completely.
Bringing us to our final section, Part 4, The Hitman Quits, A Crisis of Conscience.
So, seeing the sheer devastation of his economic models playing out in real time completely shattered Perkins' belief in the whole system. He realized he could no longer pretend that his inflated GDP projections were actually helping the citizens of the countries he was manipulating. The illusion was gone. The metaphorical storm had finally broken. He was haunted by nightmares of bloody diplomats, specifically an Iranian prime minister he had worked with, who was executed during the revolution. It all finally clicked for him. He recognized that the massive infrastructure projects he had championed were merely tools for corporate exploitation, totally designed to widen the gap between the rich and the poor. Eventually, the guilt just became too much. In 1980, drowning in depression over his own complicity in trapping these nations for the corporatocracy, he walked away. He quit his highly lucrative career at the consulting firm Maine. And while he realized he had already trained a whole new generation to follow in his footsteps, he made a promise to himself. He resolved that one day he would write a tell-all book to expose this secret history to the rest of the world. Decades later, Perkins actually met with his former college professor, the famous historian Howard Zinn, seeking some advice on dealing with his guilt. And Zinn shared this profoundly interesting insight. He suggested that the true power of the corporatocracy actually lies in our own willingness to look the other way. We accept these polished public narratives because, well, it's comfortable. It allows a failing system to persist through sheer inertia. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the foundations of our global infrastructure and economic policies were laid using highly subjective math, deliberate debt traps, and shadow maneuvers, how much of the modern world is still operating under these exact same invisible rules? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating and frankly troubling history. Keep questioning the narrative and keep seeking to understand the mechanisms that really shape our world.